Okay, I need you to hear this one. A man escapes a Nazi prison camp, crawls through the wire, reaches the forest, breathes free air for the first time in 3 years. The resistance fighters waiting for him say, "Go, now. Don't look back. The route home is mapped. His wife is waiting. Everything he survived 3 years of starvation, disease, and forced labor for is right there in front of him. And he turns around. He goes back, through the wire, into the camp, past the guards, on back to his bunk, like he never left. I know how that sounds. Stay with me. Because what Ralph Churches did next didn't just save 100 men. It became the largest and most successful prisoner of war escape in the entire history of World War II. More men freed than the famous Great Escape. More men brought home alive. And for 40 years, almost nobody knew it happened. One decision, one man, one bank clerk from Adelaide who looked freedom in the face and said, "Not yet." How does a person do that? And how did he pull off the impossible? That's exactly what we're about to find out. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now. What's the most selfless thing you've ever heard of someone doing under impossible pressure? Because I promise you, by the end of this story, your answer might change completely. And if you're new here, hit subscribe. This is exactly the kind of story we tell on this channel. So who was Ralph Churches? Because that's the part that makes this whole story hit differently. He wasn't a soldier's soldier. He wasn't some decorated war hero with a chest full of medals before any of this happened. Ralph Frederick Churches was born on the 22nd of November, 1917, in Adelaide, South Australia. One of 8 children, modest family, modest upbringing. The kind of childhood that teaches you early that resources are limited and responsibility is not optional. By the time he was in his early 20s, he was working as a bank teller. Steady job, respectable. The kind of man who showed up on time, kept careful records, and paid attention to detail. Nothing about that life suggested what was coming. On the 14th of June, 1940, just 2 days after marrying his fiancée, Ronte, Ralph enlisted in the 2nd Australian Imperial Forces 248th Battalion. 2 days after his wedding. Let that sit for a second. He shipped out to North Africa, then Syria, then Greece, following the Allied campaign wherever it needed him. In Greece, his drawing skills landed him in map-making and intelligence work, which, as it turns out, was exactly the kind of thinking that would keep him alive later. Pattern recognition, spatial awareness, the ability to look at a landscape and understand it as a system. But Greece fell fast. The German blitzkrieg didn't negotiate. Allied forces collapsed under the weight of it, outnumbered on the ground, dominated in the air. Churches and 6 other men found themselves stranded on a narrow strip of coastline, watching the last evacuation ship disappear into smoke on the horizon. No rescue coming, no orders, just burning trucks, spent ammunition, and open water. They found a rotting fishing dinghy half buried in sand. Hull split, worm-eaten, and they patched it with rags and tar scraped from wreckage and shoved it into the water under cover of darkness. For 2 weeks they rowed by night and hid in sea caves by day, drinking rainwater collected in helmets, chewing raw fish, rationing hope as carefully as food. On the 15th day, just 3 kilometers from Crete, a German patrol boat intercepted them. Rifles raised, orders barked. And just like that, the war ended for Ralph Churches before he ever fired a single shot. He was 23 years old, newly married, a bank teller from Adelaide, and he was now a prisoner of the Third Reich. Nobody could have predicted what he would do with that. Now you need to understand where they took him, because Stalag 306 was not a place designed for survival. The journey there almost killed him before he arrived. Germans packed their prisoners into cattle cars. No water, no sanitation, no room to sit or lie down properly. And for 6 days the train crawled north through Europe while men fainted from dehydration and heat. When someone collapsed and didn't get up, guards dragged the body to the door and threw it onto the tracks, without slowing down, without ceremony, just gone. By the time the survivors stumbled out at Maribor in occupied Slovenia, nearly 1 in 10 of Ralph's fellow prisoners had died from the transport alone. The rest looked decades older than when they'd boarded. The Stalag 306, also known as Stalag 18D, existed for exactly one purpose: repairing the railway lines that Allied bombers kept destroying. Every morning at 6, guards marched prisoners to work sites at gunpoint. 12 hours hauling steel rails, filling craters, packing frozen earth with broken tools. Every evening, survivors dragged themselves back through the gates for 200 grams of black bread, less than half what a man needs to function. Within 6 weeks, our Ralph could count his own ribs, but the thing that kept him awake at night wasn't his own starvation. Through the wire of the neighboring compound, he watched Soviet prisoners standing in the mud. The Germans considered Slavic prisoners beneath the protection of the Geneva Convention. They weren't being worked to death. They were simply being left to die. Ralph watched those men turn into skeletons, watched them drop one by one into the mud and not get up. He started keeping a notebook. Names to serial numbers. Neat columns, like a bank ledger recording debts. By the time he was done, he had buried 47 men. 47 names, 47 entries, each one hardening something inside him. Because Ralph Churches was doing the arithmetic that every prisoner eventually does. The Allies were winning the war, yes, but winning it slowly. At the current mortality rate, half the camp would be dead before any Allied soldier ever reached Slovenia. Waiting wasn't patience. Waiting was surrender. And Ralph Churches had not rowed 2 weeks across open water, survived 6 days in a cattle car, and buried 47 men just to surrender. Here's where Ralph Churches stops being a victim of the war and starts becoming something else entirely. He had one weapon that nobody could confiscate: his brain. Languages came easily to him. And Ralph understood something fundamental. Useful prisoners sometimes survive. So he made himself useful. He bribed a Slovenian farm boy who delivered vegetables to the camp twice a week, cigarette rations in exchange for smuggled German newspapers. Then he taught the boy to recognize letters through pantomime, acting out headlines until both of them could stumble through a sentence. One night, a guard caught him with a folded newspaper hidden inside his mattress. Ralph's heart nearly stopped. Discovery meant solitary confinement, beatings, possibly death. But the guard only glanced at the headline, snorted, and moved on. He assumed the Australian was saving it for toilet paper. Ralph lay awake for hours afterward, the paper still pressed against his ribs, knowing exactly how close he'd come to disappearing. But he kept going, night after night, whispering German vocabulary in the dark. Within 4 months, the bank clerk from Adelaide could hold real conversations with his captors, catch threats before they were spoken aloud, understand jokes. I read the room, the camp commandant noticed. Impressed by an English speaker who'd learned German faster than most university students, he appointed Ralph the official camp interpreter. The prisoners elected him their spokesman, the Vertrauensmann, the confidence man. Suddenly, Ralph was standing in the commandant's office, negotiating for extra rations, arguing to keep sick men off work details. The Germans called him Herr Churches. The Australians called him something else. In South Australian slang, a local is a crow eater. Ralph was the only South Australian in the camp. The crow was listening and planning. He also found an ally, a British prisoner named Les Laws, a jazz pianist who was fluent in German. Together, they staged musical shows for the camp, boosting morale and running black market operations under the cover of entertainment. Laws became his second in command. A lone escapee in Nazi-occupied Yugoslavia, no papers, no contacts, no maps, had a survival window measured in hours. Alone, escape wasn't bravery. It was just a slower form of suicide. Everything changed in late 1943 when a New Zealander named Freddie Russell arrived. Recently captured, Freddie had fought alongside the Yugoslav partisans before his arrest. He knew things: hidden mountain trails, coded signals to contact resistance cells, the location of a secret airstrip where Allied planes landed at night to evacuate fugitives. Ralph realized immediately the escape route existed. He just had to build the pipeline first, then fill it with men. Over the next 8 months, using his interpreter's freedom of movement, he assembled a fragile chain stretching from the camp gates to an Allied airstrip over 160 kilometers away. A blacksmith forged identity papers, a farmer hid escapees in his barn, a priest relayed messages through his parish, link by link, quietly, patiently. The crow was ready to fly. By August of 1944, everything was in place. Ralph selected 6 men for the first run: Freddie Russell, a British sergeant named Tom Price, 4 others chosen for their health, discipline, and endurance. On the night of the 29th of August, they cut through the wire with shears smuggled in by the camp blacksmith and slipped into the forest. By dawn, they reached the first partisan checkpoint. The system worked. Ralph Churches had done the impossible. He had escaped Stalag 306. The partisans urged him forward. Every calculation, logical, statistical, rational, pointed in the same direction. Go. The route was mapped. Back into the camp, back through the wire he'd just cut. They warned him if he was caught, he wouldn't be imprisoned or beaten. He'd be executed, classified as a saboteur, dealt with accordingly. Ralph listened, thanked them, turned around, and disappeared into the forest. He reached the perimeter before dawn. It waited in the trees, counting steps, shadows, and seconds. The patrol rotation memorized over 3 years of captivity. At 3 in the morning, a 30-second gap opened between guards. Ralph crawled through the cut wire, sprinted across open ground, and slid through the barracks door. By morning, he was back in his role as interpreter, translating orders, answering questions, maintaining the illusion of obedience. Inside, everything had changed. And over the next 6 weeks, he moved through the barracks at night, whispering, identifying men who could be trusted, men who could keep secrets, men who wouldn't break under pressure. He organized prisoners into groups of 12, each assigned a departure window and a partisan guide waiting at the first checkpoint. Forged papers, civilian clothes smuggled piece by piece, crude maps drawn from Freddie's intelligence. Then came the mass raid. When on the night of the 27th of September, accounts converge on a railway work detail ambush at the Ashbalt siding, Ralph, Les Laws, and 20 partisans struck. They overwhelmed the guards as the prisoner work train arrived. 105 men were freed in a single coordinated operation. The trek began immediately. 200 miles south through forests, mountains, and rivers. Columns of 20 men, each assigned a partisan guide who knew the mountains by memory rather than maps. They wore patchwork civilian coats, stolen German uniforms turned inside out, scarves fashioned from torn blankets. Some had boots, many had rags wrapped around their feet and tied with wire. For the first 3 days, luck held. Patrols searched west while the columns moved east. Men who hadn't smiled in years began joking quietly about food: eggs, bread with butter, real coffee. Then the weather turned. A blizzard swept down from the Alps. Temperatures plunged. Snow buried the trails. Men weakened by years of malnutrition began collapsing. Ralph moved up and down the line, pulling men to their feet, redistributing loads, forcing those who wanted to lie down to keep walking. He knew anyone who stopped would freeze within hours. A British sergeant sat down on a rock and refused to go further. Frostbitten feet. Told Ralph to leave him. Ralph organized a rotation of men to carry him on their backs. They carried him for 16 kilometers through the snow. 3 men didn't make it. Arthur Simmons, heart failure in the cold. David Finch fell from a cliff path in the dark. George Murray, pneumonia on the final night. Each time, Ralph pulled out his notebook, added a name, kept moving. Here's what I want to know, and I genuinely want your take in the comments. Ralph Churches buried 47 men in that camp, then lost 3 more on that mountain trek, and still kept going. Still kept every other man moving forward. What does that kind of leadership even look like from the inside? Drop your thoughts below, because the people who were there described it in ways that are almost impossible to believe. By the 28th of October, the column reached the Sava River, swollen with autumn rains, fast, freezing, and the only bridge was guarded by a German checkpoint. Impossible to move 100 men across unseen. The partisans proposed a night crossing at a ford 3 kilometers upstream, chest deep, ice cold. Ralph asked for volunteers. 12 men stepped forward, linked arms, and entered the water. The current nearly swept them away, but they reached the far bank. One by one, the rest followed in groups of 8. The crossing took 4 hours. Every single man made it across, though several had to be carried afterward, their legs numb and useless. The Germans, meanwhile, had realized something was wrong. Back at Stalag 306, a surprise inspection had revealed a quarter of the camp missing. Search parties flooded the forest. Dogs strained at their leashes. But Ralph had anticipated this. He'd manipulated the camp records for weeks, marking escaped men as transferred or hospitalized in town. By the time the alarm was fully raised, the columns were already deep in partisan territory, moving through terrain the Germans didn't know well enough to search effectively. The Luftwaffe sent aircraft. The escapees hid in trees and pressed themselves into snowbanks. Once, a patrol passed within 50 meters. Ralph pressed his face into the snow until his cheeks burned. The Germans moved on without seeing them. On the 1st of November, 1944, after 15 days of mountains, blizzards, river crossings, and German patrols, the column reached the rendezvous point, a hidden airstrip in liberated partisan territory, a flat meadow ringed by mountains, a 5 Dakota transport planes sitting on the grass, engines cold, pilots watching the sky for German fighters. Ralph counted his men, 102 standing, 3 who had stayed behind to fight alongside the partisans who saved them. Ralph had shaken each of their hands and understood. Some debts can only be paid in person. 3 names in the notebook that would never make it home, but 102 men lined up to board those planes. 102 men who had been left for dead in a Nazi work camp in occupied Slovenia. The Dakotas lifted off at 2:30 in the morning, climbing through mountain darkness toward Italy. Ralph sat on the cold metal floor, pressed between 2 men, too exhausted to speak. Through the open door, he watched the fires of the partisan camp shrink to pinpricks, then disappear. 4 hours later, the planes touched down at Bari, Italy. When the doors opened, Allied medics stared in disbelief at what emerged. 100 gaunt, hollow-eyed men in rags, some weeping, some laughing, all of them alive. British intelligence debriefed Ralph for 3 days, then handed him a document to sign. The escape was to remain classified. The partisan networks were still operating, still smuggling agents and fugitives out of occupied Europe. If the Germans learned how it worked, the pipeline would be destroyed, along with everyone connected to it. Ralph signed without hesitation. He'd kept bigger secrets than this. In November of 1944, Ralph Churches walked through the front door of his Adelaide home for the first time in 4 years. Ronte didn't recognize him at first. He weighed 58 kilograms, 40 less than when he left. Hair gone gray at the temples. The Army awarded him the British Empire Medal in a quiet ceremony. No press, no photographs. He turned down an offer to spy for the Australian Secret Intelligence Service and went back to work as a bank teller. Then moved into insurance. eventually becoming the inaugural manager for Legal and General in South Australia. When neighbors asked about the war, he said only that he'd been a prisoner for a while. Nothing much to tell. In 1963, The Great Escape premiered to worldwide acclaim. Ralph watched it in a dark Adelaide theater. Steve McQueen on a motorcycle. For tunnels dug with spoons. A stirring march to freedom. The real Great Escape of March 1944 freed 76 men from Stalag Luft III. 50 were recaptured and executed. Only 3 made it home. 5 months later, Ralph led 105 men across 160 kilometers of enemy territory in winter and brought 102 of them back alive. His escape was larger, safer, more successful, and classified. So as far as the world was concerned, it didn't exist. The credits rolled. The lights came up. Ralph walked out of the theater alone. For 40 years he kept his silence, raised his children, sang in his church choir, attended Anzac Day services, and listened to other men's stories. In 1985, the British government finally lifted the secrecy order. Ralph published his memoir, 100 Miles as the Crow Flies. A few documentaries followed. In 2017, our British broadcaster Monty Halls produced a full documentary about the escape. The route Ralph walked through Slovenia is now called the Crow's Flight, and hikers follow his footsteps through those same mountains today. Ralph Churches died on the 18th of October, 2014. He was 96 years old. He did not go back for fame. He lived most of his life in anonymity. He did not go back for medals. He couldn't even mention his medal for 40 years. He went back because he could not live with himself if he didn't. Standing at the edge of that forest, freedom tasted like betrayal. So what do we actually take from all of this? Because beyond the heroism and the mountains and the homemade escape network, there are real lessons here. Lessons that apply far beyond a Nazi work camp in occupied Slovenia. 1. The complacency trap. The Germans assumed the camp's reputation did the work for them. When the moment any institution starts believing its own invulnerability, that's when the cracks appear. Vigilance isn't a one-time decision. It's a daily practice. 2. The insider advantage. Ralph didn't escape despite being the camp interpreter. He escaped because of it. Access, trust, and perceived loyalty are the most powerful tools in any confined environment. Who you give authority to and how you monitor it matters enormously. 3. The network problem. Ralph didn't build an escape. He built a pipeline. External connections, community allies, and smuggled resources were the real infrastructure of this breakout. Cutting off outside contact isn't just policy, it's survival. 4. The patience factor. This took years. Most security systems are designed to catch impulsive behavior. They are far less equipped to detect slow, methodical, patient planning. Behavioral monitoring over time catches what spot checks never will. 5. The human variable. On every system, no matter how well designed, runs on people. And people get tired, complacent, and predictable. The most sophisticated security in the world is only as strong as the least attentive person running it. Now come back to that image with me. A man at the edge of a forest, free, wife waiting, route home mapped, and he turns around anyway, walks back into the place built to kill him because 100 men are still inside. That's not strategy. That's not calculation. That's just who Ralph Churches was. 100 families received husbands, fathers, and sons instead of telegrams. 100 men grew old and told their grandchildren about the Australian who came back for them. And one bank clerk from Adelaide spent the rest of his life knowing he had done everything a human being possibly could for the people who depended on him. And here's where I'll leave you, because I want to know what you think. If you were standing at that forest edge, free, route mapped, wife waiting, could you turn around? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. If this story hit different for you, if you finish this thinking how nobody has made a movie about this yet, share it, because this is exactly the kind of history that deserves to be remembered, and you sharing it is how it survives. Subscribe if you're new, hit the bell, and I'll see you in the next one.